Bom dia, boa tarde, boa noite, or whatever the case may be. My name is Marcus, and I am the host of the Black Brazil Today YouTube channel, as well as the blackbraziltoday.com blog, where I analyze Brazil from the perspective of race. So tonight I want to feature a video by a friend of mine. I've been knowing this guy for a number of years. Every time I'm in Rio, or if he happens to come to Sao Paulo, I try to, be able to meet up with him somewhere. His name is Carlos Alberto Medeiros. Carlos is a well-known historian and journalist. He has been an important figure in documenting Black Brazilian cultural history for a number of years. I first, discovered his name in a book by Michael Hanchard. I think that book was called Black Orpheus. And he was just talking about the civil rights and human rights struggles going on in Brazil. And Carlos Alberto Medeiros was one of the guys that he talked to for his research. As I say, a really important figure in Rio de Janeiro. Uh, I'd like to actually do an interview with Carlos one of these days. That's how important he is. I think Carlos should be probably about 75, 76, 77, somewhere in there. Um, so today I'm featuring a video that I saw off of his Instagram channel recently. Well, I've seen this video before, but today I just wanted to feature it in this post because it fits well with what I've been talking about the this color category in Brazil known as the pardo, the mixed person, the brown person, and the idea. Now, how can I put this? I always have to state that for years I always looked at what the Movimento Negro, Brazil's black social movements, would say, that brown people of mixed African ancestry, they might be African mixed, African ancestry, European ancestry, indigenous ancestry, two out of the three main races or all three mixed together. And the Movimento Negro always said that pardos and pretos represent the black population. What I came to discover myself after a number of years is that I cannot possibly define all pardos as being black. But the problem that I have with the other side, pardos in the so-called Pardo movement in Brazil is saying that pardos are not black absolutely. And I disagree with that as well. What I mean is, even though it's not accurate to say all pardos are black, it's also not accurate to say that a large percentage of those pardos could actually be considered black because of what they look like. So I'm somewhere in the middle on both extremes of how people look at this pardo conversation. Um, Recently, pardos became the largest color group in Brazil. They surpassed the white population. I think pardos, I'm going to get into the specific numbers, but we should recognize the fact that for years, Brazil has been, even when people look whiter or they look black or they look closer to the indigenous side, the point is all of these people have some degree of mixed race. So they're all pardos. You know what I'm saying? There are percentages of white Brazilians whose most of their genetic makeup is going to be European. You've got some black folks like that, but then everybody else is like mixed to some degree or whatever. And they might lean a little bit more towards white, lean a little bit more towards black, lean a little bit more towards the indigenous. But for me, looking at Brazil's history, it's like the whole country is mixed. It's just you just happen to look black, you happen to look white, you happen to look indigenous, or you look like a mix of everything. So that's where I differ with both movements there. So I wanted to talk about something that Carlos Alberto Medeiros said in one of his videos. And I think this perfectly, this kind of encapsulates what I've been saying, right? If you were to say all the Brazilian people is just one mixed bag, they're still going to say, well, if everybody's mixed, who has the advantage? Those who look closer to white or those who look closer to black, closer to indigenous, which is the point here. The name of today's video. In Brazil, for elites, there were two types of mixed race: the superior mixed race closer to white and the inferior mixed race closer to black and indigenous. Again, I think the title says it all, but let's get a little bit deeper and put this more into context. For those of you who live in Brazil, who are familiar with Brazilian people, tell me who you think these four people are. I'm sure some of you probably know all four of these guys. Maybe you might know one of them or two of them. But for those of you who live in Brazil, who are you follow the media, you follow sports, can you tell me who these four guys are? Anyway, let's keep it moving. That's just a little trivia question right there. Now, before I get started, I want to point out As of 2022, the Pardo group in Brazil is considered the majority, 55.3% of the population, over 92 million Pardos. And again, within that Pardo category, you have people who look more indigenous, people who look closer to white, and people who look closer to black. This is why I always say it's hard to say what Brazil's black population is, because it's you got some people in that Pardo category and some people in the Preto category. Just how many of those people should be considered black, I can't really give a accurate just precise number on that. 88 million people consider themselves white people or brancas, which is 43.5% of the population. 20 million pessoas pretas, meaning black people, corresponding to 10%. So again, let me just finish this. 1.6 million indigenous, 850,000 what we'll say persons of Asian descent, mostly Japanese. But the thing I want to point out is that when you look in the Pardo category, then you see 20 million black people and almost 1.7 million indigenous people. Some of those black people and some of those indigenous people can be found under the Pardo category. That's why it's so complex about trying to figure out how many black people and how many indigenous people there are in Brazil, because so many of those people are within this Pardo category. Pardo could be seen just as a color. Some people say it's just mixed race or it's brown, but it's a mixture of a whole lot of different phenotypes in that group. So out of this 90 million, I don't know, maybe you'll have 30 million who could probably consider black, maybe 40 million. I'm not sure. How many of those people could be considered indigenous? And when I say indigenous, I mean maybe an Indian European mixture, what we'll call a Latino look. Anyway, so that's what I'm saying. Officially 2022, they call Pardos they surpassed the white population. But I would argue that even in this white category, it says 88 million white people. And I'm going to say a lot of those white people in Brazil would not be considered white anywhere else in the world, but they consider themselves white. So all of these numbers can be skewed a little bit because none of us really know. And it's going to just depend on how people see things. You might see somebody as white. I might see them as brown. Somebody else might see them as black. You just never know. That's why I say we have to take a grain of salt when we're talking about race in Brazil and the numbers of black, white, indigenous, and mixed people. Pardos are the majority, even among pretos and brancos, or blacks and whites, there is mixture. So that's to say within the white population and within the black population, there are people who are mixed. Within the Pardo population, you have people who look white, people who look indigenous, people who look black. So we don't know. I'm never going to say that I can tell you. I'm going to say this: it's more than 20 million black people in Brazil, but it's probably less than 120 million, as a lot of people say. Defining all Brazilians as Pardos won't solve racial inequality because the standard remains proximity to whiteness. So even if you say the entire Brazilian population is Pardo, is mixed, you still have people leaning closer to white, people leaning closer to black, some people leaning closer to indigenous, some people who are just so mixed, you can't really put them in any one racial category. That's the problem, what I would say with identifying the whole population as Pardo, because when you have whiteness as the standard, it's going to skew the data. People who are in the white category who are actually brown, people who categorize themselves as brown who are closer to white, people who categorize themselves as brown and they're closer to black. How can we believe any of the data coming out of Brazil when their self-identity might be different than how somebody else classifies them? So we have to take statistics on race in Brazil with a grain of salt. The indigenous factor must also be considered in the Pardo category. That's what I just said. A lot of Pardos are going to look more indigenous. They're not all just black. I have to say that. The historical origins of embranquecimento or whitening, this idea that elites wanted to mix the population so that within 50 to 100 years, the population would be mostly white or something close to it. And again, what Carlos is pointing out in this short clip is that the elites have always seen superior people of mixed race and the inferior people of mixed race. If we can get them leaner closer to the white side, they could be considered honorary whites or something close to white or actually white. Because again, in Brazil, you can be white even if you have indigenous and African ancestry in your bloodline. Okay, so this is Carlos Alberto Medeiros. He has a doctorate in comparative history from the Federal University of Rio de Janeiro from 2020, a master's degree in legal and social sciences from the Fluminense Federal University in 2003. He has been an activist in the Black movement since the 1970s and has held various government positions at federal, state, and municipal levels, having been the special coordinator for the promotion of racial equality for the municipality of Rio de Janeiro between 2009 and 2011. Okay, he's put out a number of books. He's an excellent translator. He's the author of Na Lei e na Raça, Legislação e Relações Raciais, Brazil, Estados Unidos, in the law and in the race, legislation and racial relations, Brazil, United States. He's a co-author of Racismo, Preconceito and Intolerância, meaning racism, prejudice, and intolerance. Translator of several works into Portuguese, including Amor Líquido by Zygmunt Bauman, and Autobiografia de Martin Luther King, the autobiography of Martin Luther King, por uma Revolução Africana by Frantz Fanon. Everybody is probably familiar with that book. So these are the covers of 3 of the books. This book right here being just a straight translation done by Carlos Medeiros. Okay. So what I want to do right now is just overdub what Carlos had to say, and then I'm going to go, again, put it in context, and then just expand on what he's talking about. So let's do an overdub on his video first. Count Gobineau himself, the French ambassador to Brazil, was a close friend of Dom Pedro II, said that Brazil would have no future due to this miscegenation. Well, it's no wonder that at that time what I call an alternative racism appeared. Moderate, in quotation marks, full of quotation marks. The idea that, no, mixed race people were not all inferior. There were 2 types of mixed race people. The superior mixed race person closer to white people from a cultural and phenotypic point of view, who would tend to be absorbed, assimilated. And the inferior mixed race person closer to the black people, to indigenous people, and this one, yes, would disappear. This vision, which I call moderate, ended up predominating, and it was expressed clearly in 1911 at the World Congress of Races held in London by the Brazilian representative João Batista de Lacerda, who said, in no uncertain terms, in a text written in French, which was the English of the time, sur les métiers Brésil, about mixed race people in Brazil, that Brazil was solving this problem of black people. It was, as they said, the problem of black people through miscegenation, that within 100 years there would be no more black people in Brazil. So, considering Carlos's words, we must look into the context and sentiments of that time in Brazil's history. The institution of slavery was on its last leg, and the country's leaders were looking forward to the future and Brazil's image and position on the world stage. So by 1880, the Brazilian white elite and slaveholders were faced with 2 imminent repercussions of the abolition of slavery that threatened to derail every aspect of the society and the economy. The 6 million free blacks about to be unleashed on society and the loss of slave labor for the plantations. Bolstered by the authority of racist science, they devised an ingenious solution that was to solve both problems simultaneously: the importation of millions of white Europeans to work on the plantation and interbreed with black women. So check what they're doing here. Again, I've talked about this. Brazil brought in what people are saying about 5 million enslaved Africans. And then as slavery was ended, they opened Brazil's borders in the late 1800s to about 4 to 5 million European immigrants coming from Portugal, Spain, Germany. You had some from Poland. Italy became the biggest ethnic group in Brazil over those years. So the idea was not only to increase the white numbers in Brazil by numerical majority, but also by enticing them to mix with black and indigenous women and promote miscegenation. After 2 or 3 generations, all of these families would start turning white or something close to it. The ultimate outcome was to be the creation of a new white Brazil, cleansed of its black blood and of all memory of slavery, so that Brazil could take its place honorably among other white nations. As with the social whitening of free blacks and mulattoes, blacks were again induced to become complicit in a diabolical plan to eradicate the black race from Brazil. And as throughout Brazilian history, sex was at the center of their erasure in the guise of intimacy. So then what we have here is Brazilian elites promote the idea of like, oh, we cannot be racist here because we all mix. White men have had relations with black women and indigenous women. But underneath that, selling this as we're all equal, we're all the same, we don't have racial problems here. The ultimate goal was mixing with Black and indigenous women, so to promote a whiter population. So it was erasure in the guise of intimacy. Interracial sex is at the very center of the myth of racial democracy in Brazil, because the idea is, if we're mixing with each other, how can we be racist? Well, the ideology says the goal is we want to whiten the population. That's why it's racist. The belief that it could be possible to do away with 6 million Blacks and mulattoes such that no trace would remain of them illustrates what white Brazilians were still in denial of the Black nation they had wrought, and were grasping at any means of holding on to their precarious social and economic privilege, which had been entirely dependent on slavery. Here's a picture, the whitening of the Brazilian people. You go to Brazil and you'll just find a lot of families that have darker elements in their family. And if you go back a couple of generations, you'll see the darker elements. And then the family of today is represented by white people or lighter skinned mestizos, right? The whitening of the Brazilian people. Joseph Arthur G. Gobineau was a French aristocrat whose claim to fame was helping to introduce the so-called scientific race theory and racial demography, as well as developing the theory of the Aryan master race and Nordicism. Nordicism is the viewpoint in which Nordic people are an endangered but superior race group. Gobineau's book on the inequality of the human races, published in 1853, positioned the white race as superior. In 1869, Gobineau was appointed the French minister to Brazil and was a good friend of Brazil's then emperor, Pedro II, which Carlos spoke about in his video. For the Frenchman, Brazil would have no future if it did not whiten itself, if it did not get rid of Blacks. Such statements served wonderfully to justify the arrival of Europeans for manual labor, usually the assignment of slaves. Thus, their conception served as a scientific basis for whitening policy. Slavery was bankrupt and an alternative was needed that would become firm over time. Brazil was, to use today's language, being rethought. So check out what's going on here. It should be pointed out that even though Gobineau was one of the people that talked about, look, you guys need to whiten this population, it wasn't just an idea that Brazilians got from the French or from this French aristocrat. From my own research, and I have to find that source, a Portuguese Freemason suggested, hey, why don't you guys suggest promoting miscegenation in Brazil until you become white? Brazilian elites completely were on board with this, because at the time, we're talking late 1800s, early 1900s, elites, statesmen, aristocrats in Brazil were all debating, how long is it going to take for us to whiten this country? Some people say 1 generation, some people say 2, 3, 4. People would say 100 years, and other people would say, look, that's too long. We need Brazil to be whiter quicker than that. So the idea of whitening Brazil has been going on for at least a century and a half. So I want to be clear that it's not just Gobineau, a Frenchman, who's talking about whitening Brazil. Brazilian elites were completely on board with this idea. Let me see here. Brazil needed to look like, quote unquote, civilized people. Blacks were the material evidence of miscegenation. Even in those times, the conception of explicit ethnic cleansing would not be well regarded. It was better to pretend that the millions of new immigrants coming organized with their families and relatives would improve or counterbalance the Black, miserable, and illiterate population through the imposition of their masters. Predictions of when whitewashing would be celebrated as a success depended on the optimism of racial politicians or racist politicians and thinkers. 50 years, 70 years, 100 years. Again, they were debating on how long this whitening of the population, how long they would need for this to happen. The expectation was that Blacks and dark mulattoes would disappear entirely. Ethnic cleansing was going to work as a product of whitening and the diseases that killed the miserable. Everyone here, or everyone is ugly here, unbelievably ugly, like apes, exclaimed French diplomat Joseph Arthur de Gobineau, or Gobineau. I guess it's Gobineau. Sent to Brazil by Napoleon upon arriving in Rio de Janeiro during the Carnival celebrations of 1869. Just some portraits, some pictures of the Brazilian people. I don't know, late 1800s, early 1900s, somewhere in there. He continued, the Brazilians are nothing more than the lowest kind of mulattoes, a wholly half-caste population of vitiated descent, vitiated intelligence, and fearfully ugly. Not a single Brazilian is of pure blood because the pattern of marriages among whites, Indians, and blacks is so widespread that the nuances of color are infinite, causing a degeneration of the most wretched kind among the lower as well as the upper classes. The result is deformed physiognomies, which, if they are not always repugnant, are always unpleasant to look upon. Listen what Gobineau said about the Brazilian people. You know, he arrived in Brazil, as I said, in 1869, and he was disgusted by what the Brazilian people look like. He's like, even in the upper class, in the lower class, the white Brazilian is a mulatto. They're not pure blood white. So this is what he's complaining about. You Brazilians, you have mixed. Okay, I want to be clear. I don't want to offend anybody. These are not my words. These are Gobineau's words, where he says everyone is ugly here, unbelievably ugly. So in his view, this mixture of people, and when it leads away from getting away from the quote unquote Aryan race, the pure and beautiful race, and the Brazilians were mixing. So it's like even the people you consider white are not white. So this is how a French diplomat saw Brazil in the 1860s and 70s. This is what Gobineau thought. It must be noted that, according to Gobineau, the so-called whites of Brazil at that time were also a mixed breed. Remember that, in his view, there was a need for whiteness, which would eventually lead to a mass importation of Europeans into Brazil. Still today, this view of the white Brazilian seems to be simply not white enough. Millions of today's white Brazilians simply aren't white, and they know it. Keep in mind the 2018 article entitled "Demand for American Sperm Skyrocketing in Brazil." This is a story I did in 2018. Since 2011, Brazilian purchases of American sperm for artificial insemination has increased by 3,000%. 95% chose white male donors. 51% chose men with blue eyes. So women who were looking for artificial insemination, they made sure that the men they were getting it from were going to be white, preferably with blue eyes. So what does that say about what type of children? The research that I saw, it didn't say what type of women wanted this. To me, as you know, if artificial insemination is something that you need money to do, I would assume these are not black and brown women who are doing this. It's probably white women. I could be wrong, but what I'm saying is, it just says that for a lot of people, the whiteness that Brazil has is not a real white. It's like an off-white. That's why we say Brazilian white. And I'm not saying there are Brazilians who would be clearly classified as white anywhere in the world, but there are a large percentage of the Brazilian population who defines itself as white that's just actually light-skinned mixed people. Okay. Speaking on Brazilian whiteness, the sociologist Guilherme Ramos, this guy right here, he once said, "I emphasize the word branco, meaning white, because our white is, from an anthropological point of view, a mestizo, a person of mixed race. And among us, the white who does not have black blood is a small minority." Guilherme Ramos was saying this in the 50s and 60s, saying that our white people aren't really white. They're actually just light-skinned mestizos. It's very rare to find white people in Brazil who don't have at least a little bit of black blood. Ramos continued his argument by emphasizing that it is in the Brazilian North and Northeast where the traces of the social pathology of the Brazilian white are clearest, as these are the regions with the highest percentage of blacks and mestizos in Brazil. Again, this is sociologist Guilherme Ramos. Ramos concluded his reflection on this point by saying that the results of the census, when considering the percentage of whites in the population, would be much lower if only people who do not have black blood are considered white. The pure white in such regions is exceptional, while the apparent white is a minority there. Listen to what he said. This is what I was just saying. The numbers of white Brazilians in general, particularly in the North and the Northeast, would be much lower if you're only talking about people who have a vast majority of white DNA. Unless you include mixed white people, which is possible in Brazil, you can be mixed in Brazil and considered white. But if you don't include mixed white people, the population of white Brazilians diminishes significantly. He was saying this 50, 60 years ago. So this is what I'm saying about the importation of Europeans. They realize not only do they have a large black and brown population, but of the white people that's there, a large percentage of the white people that were there were actually mixed themselves. Ambassador Gobineau resided in Rio de Janeiro from April 1869 to May of 1870 as head of the French diplomatic mission. He became known as one of Brazil's most critical observers. He found the country insufferable. He thought Brazil was a backwater, hated Rio's tropical climate, but more than anything, he loathed the Brazilian people. He was particularly disgusted by the widespread miscegenation among them. He found a ready audience for his views among Brazilians who attributed the country's underdevelopment and its backwardness in reaching modernization to its black population. So they're blaming the backwardness that he saw in Brazil on the large black population in Brazil, right? Clear racist views, right? Physician and biomedical scientist João Batista de Lacerda reported, the importation on a vast scale of the black race into Brazil exerted a harmful influence on the progress of this country. It delayed its material development for a long time and made it difficult to use its immense natural wealth. The character of the population suffered from defects and vices of the imported inferior race. This is what Lacerda is talking about. This is the guy who went to the London Congress of Races, first Universal Racist Congress, where he estimated that within 100 years, Brazil was going to be white because of the death rates of black and brown Brazilians, but also due to the promotion of miscegenation in Brazil. So that's João Lacerda. Let's get back into the story here. Let me see. So for this, many of Brazil's politicians, writers, and intellectuals blame the Portuguese colonizers. Whites were infuriated at Portugal for the mass importation of Africans over centuries that now left them surrounded by an overwhelming black population, a quote-unquote black stain that they needed to somehow wipe out. At the beginning of our colonization, wrote Joaquim Nabuco, this guy right here, former Brazilian ambassador to the United States. According to Nabuco, Portugal unloaded its criminals, its wrong women, its social feces all over our territory. Brazil was then like the Congo until yesterday. You know, when you dig into Brazilian history and you look at not only what Brazilian elites themselves were saying, but what foreign diplomats were saying about the country, it's just clear scientific racism. They despised the black population. They blamed the black population for the look of how Brazilians looked because they were not purely white. And then they say that Brazil's backwardness is due to its large black population. Before I put other things in the context here, I want to definitely give I want to source what I'm talking about here. One of the articles is called Diluting the African Nation, European Immigration, Whitening, and the Crisis of Slave Emancipation by Lamonte Edu. Branqueamento como política brasileira de exclusão social dos negros, séculos XIX e XX, or Whitening as a Brazilian policy of social exclusion of black people in the 19th and 20th centuries by Gilberto de Abreu Sodré Carvalho. Then the other article that I just cited was Guilherme Ramos and the Racial Question in Brazil by Jonas Manuel. Okay, definitely. I mean, if you start digging into this, you'll find a lot of material like this, just what the conversation was in the 19th century of Brazil and how they wanted to solve the race problem by encouraging miscegenation in the country. Now, why this story today is so important, I just did a video where it was saying how after elections, 6 Brazilian capital cities will have black mayors, all right wing. The question is, what kind of black men are these? And this is a story I was saying, I said in the video that I did, this guy was the only guy who I consider to be brown, black, or mixed. The rest of these guys are like off-white. Now, if we say off-white, does that mean that these are the mixed race white people that Guilherme Ramos was talking about? Because if you look at their pictures, okay, look at this guy right here. I don't know, does he have an Italian look? Right? Obviously, this is former president, extreme conservative president Jair Bolsonaro, but look at this guy. So I have pictures of each one of these guys for you to just take a conclusive look. This is the only guy that I would say is black or brown in the bunch. But what it is that these guys define themselves as brown or pardos. And so because under the black movement's criteria of blackness, they include brown people as black. But in this case, if they do, in fact, define themselves as pardo, they're more on the white side of the pardo spectrum, okay? Which is why this is important. What he's talking about, like, okay, so I've talked about this young lady here where she says pardos are not black. Some pardos are black. I've seen it, in my years visiting back and forth from Brazil. I accept that not all pardos are black, but a large percentage of them are. Okay. In Brazil, the census shows the number of self-declared brown people or pardos surpasses whites for the first time. So that's what the story was. The census taker were going to, people's houses, and they came to conclude in 2022 that Brazil is a majority brown country. A major presence of blacks in the country reflects racial recognition. So black and brown, the growth of those percentages of those two color categories is because of a lot of racial recognition. There are some people who have defined themselves as white and they finally came to see themselves as brown, mixed, or off-white, which contributes to the growth of the mixed race pardo category. Okay. Just a lot of people have, some white people have moved to the brown category and some brown people have moved to the black category. That's a lot of what's going on in the census in Brazil. Let's see. This was a story I did a couple months back. Man was arrested for taking out his 7-month pregnant ex-black girlfriend because he didn't want to have a black child. This was a crazy story. I mean, what kind of attitude did this guy have? This guy is not white himself. The girl I see, okay, this is what I mean by, okay, people would label her as a pardo, but I see, African and indigenous influences in her, how she looks. So this guy, he took her out. He did not want to have a black child, which is kind of crazy to me because I'm saying both of them being fair skinned, they probably would have had a fair skinned baby, but what's up with that? When persons of mixed race are the biggest races, Congressman says monkeys have a higher IQ than Africans. Okay, so what I'm saying with this story here, and somebody else pointed this out, in Brazil, you have what you call whites of dubious color. This is what Guilherme Ramos was talking about in the previous article that I was just reading. He was saying that the only way you can have a large white population in Brazil is if you include mixed white people in the population, because if you're looking for purely white people in Brazil, that number drops significantly. Now, I don't know if this guy considers himself white, but this guy right here, his historic figure, I'm going to talk a little bit about this. Let me see, where is the point? Let me see here. Okay, so this is Nina Rodriguez and this is Gustavo Gayer. Both of them, spoke negatively about black people. And what the guy who wrote this article says is that the similarities between these two guys go beyond racist ideas about Africans. They start with their appearance. Both are the so-called doubtful whites or dubious whites. Nina Rodriguez comes to be described by some authors as a mulatto or mestizo himself. This guy right here. The Bolsonarista congressman, the guy on the right who is a Bolsonaro supporter, this guy is clearly not white. I mean, maybe he identifies himself as white, but what do you think? The congressman was also called by some people in the press a mestizo of blacks and even negro or black by some. Sometimes it is by demeaning Africans that Brazilian whites feel closer to Europe. That's the trigger. So this is what I'm saying. I see a lot of this in Brazil where somebody will make a racist comment to a clearly black person, and then you look at a person who's making the comment, and it's like, who are you insulting, a black or brown person with the way that you look? Because you're not white either. Happens all the time in Brazil. It was just a case like that a couple of weeks ago. So anyway, this is what I wanted to share in today's video. What did you think about today's material? Drop a comment in the comment section, like this video, share this video, consider subscribing to the channel, click on the notification bell so you know when I put up another video. With that said, I'm going to end this video here and request that you all come back. Check out the next video that I post here at Black Brazil Today.